How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to another lecture here for U.S. history. I hope you guys are doing well. And today we're going to be looking at the beginnings of World War II in America once the war is actually underway. Last week we looked at some of the kind of precursors to war, the events that were happening across the world that led to war, as well as the U.S.'s response to those events in an attempt to stay neutral. But then we will see today how eventually that neutrality ended, how the U.S. went into World War II, and then how the war impacted life both at home and abroad. Now, today we'll be focusing primarily on the Pacific Theater or the Japanese front. Next week, we'll be wrapping that up and then also looking at Europe. So, without further ado, let's get going here. Now, the first thing you're going to do on your Google Doc is very quickly write down in maybe 2 or 3 sentences just your impression of this quote from FDR. So he was elected in 1940 for a third time, and he gives this speech, or he says this during his third inaugural, where he says, "Democracy alone of all forms of government enlists the full force of men's enlightened will. It is the most humane, the most advanced, and in the end the most unconquerable of all forms of human society. The democratic aspiration is no mere recent phase of human history. We would rather die on our feet than live on our knees." So just really quickly on your Google Doc on the first question, just give a brief 2 or 3 sentence kind of analysis of this quote. What is FDR saying? What was he telling the people? What's he kind of pointing towards, I guess, in this speech? All right. So in August 1941, the war has started. Okay. However, the U.S. is not in the war. Keep that in mind. That doesn't happen until later on. Now, in August of 41, FDR and Churchill meet off the coast of Canada, and they issue a document called the Atlantic Charter. It essentially has a list of goals that they two agree with for the war. Now, what you have to kind of think to yourself is if they're meeting, right, and they're discussing what the goals for the war are, even though the U.S. isn't in the war yet, what might be the implication? Right? Implication would very obviously be that the U.S. is probably going to join the war at some point. Now remember, FDR was kind of much more towards the side of joining the war, whereas Congress and many American people were against that. The Atlantic Charter said that the goals for the war were collective security, again, kind of like the post-World War I goals of creating more peace and less war, disarmament, okay, weakening the armies of nations, self-determination, the right for people to choose their own governments and leaders, economic cooperation across the world, and freedom of the seas. You guys might remember these are very similar to Wilson's 14 points at the end of World War I. This kind of goes to show that those things were not met in the post-World War I world, and so this is kind of the redo, if you will. Roosevelt also later gave another speech called the Four Freedoms speech, in which he kind of talked about how the U.S. needs to fight for the four freedoms across the world, the four freedoms being freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. These four freedoms were captured in these very famous Norman Rockwell paintings. There's one to the right here. But essentially, again, he's saying that the U.S. needs to fight to make the world a better place, and World War II is this sort of malleable junction or juncture in history in which things can change for the better or for the worse. And the U.S. is in its best interest to get involved in order to fight for what is right, in his opinion. So we start seeing a growing conflict between the U.S. and Japan in the years leading up to World War II. Okay, the Japanese had resented U.S. immigration policy, which, as we've seen, was rather racist at this point, and the Japanese had always coveted possession of the Philippines, which the U.S. at this point controlled, mostly for its raw resources. Japan invaded China in 1937, and the U.S. condemned that internationally, which again angered the Japanese. And then after the Japanese signed the tripartite agreement and joined the Axis powers, the U.S. embargoed all aviation or airplane fuel and scrap metal being sold to Japan. Again, Japan being an island and being rather resource poor, at least in terms of resources that are necessary for an industrial nation and an industrial war, this essentially cut Japan off from a lot of the resources it needed. And then in July of 41, the US froze all Japanese assets in the US. So any sort of money or holdings that the government had in the US, those were frozen, unable to be accessed. Okay. And then the US's decryption program, MAGIC, intercepted news that the Japanese were planning an attack on the US. They knew it was coming, but not where exactly it was coming. Okay. And so eventually that would lead to the attack of Pearl Harbor. Here we see a photo from that day. Okay. So, on December 7th, the Japanese attack the US at Pearl Harbor. They crossed the Pacific in radio silence, making no communications. There's 60 ships, 6 aircraft carriers with 360 planes. And in the attack, 19 American ships were sunk or disabled, 160 aircraft were destroyed, over 2,000 people were killed, and another 1,000 were wounded. There was some silver lining to this in that the US aircraft carriers were actually out on a training exercise on the day of the attack, which spared us our aircraft carriers. At this point, the US had only 4 aircraft carriers compared to the Japanese's 6. These were going to prove to be the most powerful seagoing units of the war. And having lost them from an early stage would have definitely crippled us. The Japanese goal in Pearl Harbor was to launch a massive blow that the US could not recover from. The idea was that they would knock us out in one strike and we wouldn't even be able to start a war against them. However, this didn't end up working. We started a war against them and then we would eventually win that war. But at the beginning, as we'll see, the Japanese were definitely on the front foot and we were on the back foot. Some more photos here from that day that will live in infamy, December 7th, 1941. All right, so at this point, the Japanese Empire was really rather expanded, as you can see the orange line being the extent of their control, and the orange shaded area as well. As you can see, they're close to a lot of things. They're working their way into China. They've captured Burma, so they're moving towards India, which is still a British possession at this point. They're moving towards Australia in the south, and they're pushing towards Hawaii and the US West Coast in the west. So, the war against Japan was very much also a propaganda war. So for your next question, I'd like you to just kind of jot down what is the purpose of propaganda and how can propaganda help a country win a war? Okay, this will be one of our main focuses for today's lesson. Second question I'd like you to jot down, I guess third question in your Google Doc, is how would you have felt in the days after Pearl Harbor? Imagine you're living where you are now, right? You're just a student, a junior at Lindbergh High School, even though it wasn't open yet, and you hear the news of Pearl Harbor happening. How would you feel? What were some emotions that would go through your mind, and kind of how would this event have impacted you? Okay, so back to Japan. Here we have Japanese control, like I said, another vision of that. And so at this point, we have really massive Japanese expansion. The Japanese were definitely punching well above their weight. Their technology was very advanced. Their war machine was well oiled, for lack of a better term, and they were fighting with great tenacity. On the same day they attacked Pearl Harbor, they also attacked the Philippines and captured that as well. The Philippines, again, had a lot of resources, especially tin and some oil, which the Japanese were frozen out of in the US, and so they went and captured the Philippines from us. Our soldiers did what they could to fight off the Japanese, but eventually they were forced to surrender. Some were able to escape to Australia or other islands in the south there. However, many were left in the Philippines. This led to another one of the very famous events of World War II, which was the Bataan Death March. Many of the American soldiers were captured on the Bataan Peninsula. You can see here, if you look at my mouse on the right here, the Bataan Peninsula here in the south of the Philippines. And essentially, the American soldiers were captured here along with many Filipino soldiers and forced to march along this path here to a concentration or POW camp in the north. Along this marching route, many American soldiers and Filipino soldiers were summarily executed, beaten, forced to walk without shoes, withheld water and food, and generally subjected to very poor treatment by the Japanese soldiers. The Japanese had this notion of Bushido, or the warrior code, something borrowed from the samurai code, in which anyone who surrendered was deemed unworthy of good treatment, and so many of the American POWs were treated not according to actual laws of the time of how you treat POWs. We also had our fair share of mistreatment of the Japanese. In the week after Pearl Harbor, about 300,000 enemy aliens, the term was used at the time, anyone who was not a U.S. citizen, although for the Japanese many were, who was considered to be on an enemy side, so Japanese, Germans, Italians were rounded up. Many were relocated as part of Executive Order 9066 that was issued on February 19th of 1942. And for the Japanese, about 120,000 of these people were rounded up, pushed into various holding areas at like racetracks and other things like that, and then eventually sent to internment camps. And 2/3 of these Japanese were actual U.S. citizens, not just residents. Okay, most of this happened on the West Coast, as you can see here on the map, but not Hawaii. Many would speculate that because the Japanese were such an important labor force in Hawaii, they were spared that, which again kind of points to the racial aspect of this because, well, why not Hawaii? That's where there would be the most potential for espionage, one would think, due to Pearl Harbor. These internment camps were ran by the War Relocation Authority. Many of the Germans and Italians that were rounded up were just relocated if their houses were in areas that were considered military zones, so within a mile of the water or close to any kind of bases, they were forced to leave their homes or businesses, so it was still a big event for them, but very few were actually sent to the camps. Italians, only about 257 were sent to the camps, which is very small compared to 120,000, and Germans about 2,000. Okay, and the U.S. Supreme Court actually upheld the decision to send these people to relocation camps in the Korematsu versus U.S. Supreme Court case. Despite that, the many Japanese Americans still elected to fight for the United States. The Nisei, so Nisei means first generation Japanese Americans, people born to Japanese parents but in the U.S. The 442nd Regiment was an all Japanese American fighting regiment, which was the most, I wrote one of the most, but actually the most highly decorated unit in World War II. They won the most medals of any other unit, definitely proving their loyalty to the United States. Okay, so we have a few important turning point battles, the battles of Coral Sea and Midway. In Coral Sea, it's the first ever battle in which it's completely carried out by aircraft carriers, so they never actually see each other. Get it? Coral Sea, see? I know, very funny. And then Midway, the Japanese were planning an attack on Midway. We intercepted messages of that. We were able to defeat the Japanese, and at that point, we started to push back towards the Japanese-controlled areas. Our policy was called island hopping. If you look here, we basically went from island to island to island. We'd capture an island and then use that island to basically stage an attack on the next island. Okay, and this allowed us to kind of push towards the Japanese mainland and eventually capture Japan as well, or push towards capturing Japan. We never did, but that was the goal. Okay. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf, we recaptured the Philippines, or we started the recapture of the Philippines, which was obviously something that we had sought to do to limit the Japanese control of materials. And then there's two very bloody battles, Iwo Jima and Okinawa, in which of the Japanese 20,000 or so soldiers, up to 19,000 were killed before they surrendered, which kind of pointed to the tenacity of their forces, along with the use of kamikaze pilots, pilots whose sole purpose it was to fly into American ships. This made ideas of attacking Japan unappealing. Here we see some maps. The Doolittle raid was a kind of daring raid. You can Google that if you want to look at more what it was, but essentially it was kind of our first moral victory against the Japanese, in which we bombed a few Japanese cities. Here we see the Coral Sea map, the Battle of Midway map, and some very famous photos from the Pacific Theater. Now, our last thing today is going to be looking at propaganda. Now, what I'd like you guys to do is open up Google Docs or Google Classroom and look at the document packet there. The question is, based on the documents in the race war DBQ, why do you think there was so much brutality between the US and Japan? Please write a 1 to 2 paragraph response.